Jose, Regina, nice to see you.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good, thank you. How's the family? Everybody's fine?
Thank God we're all doing fine.
Good. Glad to hear that. Let me open my container. I'm sorry.
All right, that's set up, that's running. Let's just pop that out. And we will wait a few minutes as people navigate the system. Just turning off my ringer so I don't get disturbed. As always, to our YouTube watchers, I can't see who's watching, but it's always nice to have you let me know who's there, just so I can bring up the mental picture of our additional participants who don't have a camera. Okay, well, I think we are...
Everything's working. Everything is good.
Everything's good, good.
Yes, yes.
So let's go ahead and get things moving. So as I already said, but I'll repeat it because it's always good to say good afternoon to everyone. I hope everybody is doing well. We are reaching the end of the 5780. It kind of got a little pushed around because of various events, but our cycle of classes will finish tonight, and then we're going to start again next Thursday. So tune in next Thursday. We're beginning again. It's back to the beginning. So if you joined halfway through, don't worry. That means you'll be getting the beginning stuff when we start up again next week. If you've been working with me for the entire cycle, that's great. You can review and still attend if you like. If not, then we need to start talking about moving you to the next stage of conversion if that is your goal. But for tonight, we are going to finish this series by talking about welcoming Shabbat through our liturgy, through our prayers. And this is generally referred to as Kabbalat Shabbat, although technically Kabbalat Shabbat is only one part of the service. Instead, there is Kabbalat Shabbat and Mariv, also known as Arvit, the evening service. And we're going to break these down into the pieces. I'll explain why each is called what they are and explain how they developed historically. And of course, most importantly, how we develop spiritually through our engagement with the service. So let's go ahead and get things rolling. So the basic structure of a Friday night service is to begin with Kabbalat Shabbat, the formal welcome of Shabbat, followed by an optional, although very common, period of study, and then Mariv, also known as Arvit, the evening service, and then some additional concluding passages which appear in Shabbat, which don't come on a regular evening service. We're going to go through each of these in turn. So Kabbalat Shabbat is so popular that it has actually become the name of the entire Friday night service for Shabbat. But technically, and technically is important because it helps us learn more, technically Kabbalat Shabbat is the preliminary service for a Friday night service. Technically, it is the lead-in to Shabbat, not Shabbat itself, although depending upon what time zone you live in, that may vary. Now, the idea of welcoming Shabbat is a very, very old one. But in the Middle Ages, people began to specifically adopt new poems, new rituals that would mark that time period where the sun was going down and we were preparing to greet Shabbat. So this time in the Middle Ages, beginning in around the 1500s, it was when the acceptance of Shabbat, the greeting of Shabbat, became its own official system. Now, I'm not going to go into too much of the history, but you should know that this process of creating this pre-service for Friday night was a long one. There were many different communities. They had different traditions and different practices, and eventually it coalesced, it came together to be the service that we see. But even the service that is so common in the Ashkenazic community, of which I am a member, is not 100% the same in every community, nor is it 100% the same between Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Mizrahi and all the other different Jewish cultural groups around the world or who have come from around the world. So Kabbalat Shabbat has a lot more room for variety because this is not considered to be an official, formal, and absolutely required part of the service. We certainly do it and we include it with joy and happiness, but if there was ever an emergency and you couldn't do the entire service, you would drop Kabbalat Shabbat before you would drop anything from the Mariv service. But of course, we are blessed with time, so we have plenty of time to do it all. Now, the current structure of Kabbalat Shabbat that you'll find in most communities will begin with Shalom Aleichem. It's not exactly a formal Kabbalat Shabbat element. This song was written more for the home, but many people now sing it in the synagogue as well. Yedid Nephesh, as well, as we'll see, is a beautiful poem and has become a song. But the meat and bones, the main core of Kabbalat Shabbat, are a selection of psalms, Psalm 95 through 99 inclusive, and Psalm 29, together of which they mark a psalm for each day of the week. Lecha Dodi, which is a beautiful poem, which again is usually sung, and then Psalms 92 and Psalm 93 as the true formal beginning of Shabbat. And we'll break these down. Shalom Aleichem is a song that's based off a passage in the Talmud, Shabbat 119b, which talks about two angels that will travel home with us from services. And if Shabbat has been prepared well, the table is ready, people are peaceful, everybody is focused on greeting Shabbat and greeting each other with kindness and love, then the good angel will say, may next Shabbat be like this. And the bad angel, I'll explain in a second, will have to say Amen. And if Shabbat is not done well, then the bad angel is the one who says, may next Shabbat be like this. And the good angel says Amen. Now, is there such a thing as a bad angel? No. God does not create manifestations of his will that are bad. However, from our point of view, there are angels which will support what we do and angels which will challenge what we do. And both are very important, right? Everything we do can be supported or it can be potentially blocked. And from our point of view, that will certainly seem bad or negative, but that doesn't mean that it is inherently negative. For example, you are leaving work late on Friday, you're trying to rush home, but there's just way too much traffic, the lights are all wrong, and you get home in a mad panic, throw everything together for Shabbat, and dive in. Well, your Shabbat welcoming is going to be a little not so great. Those barriers, those problems that you faced, that is, in quote, the bad angel, the negative effects in the world that can take away from Shabbat. And what this idea is trying to tell us is that when you take the time to truly prepare, usually beginning somewhere on Thursday, and make sure that you have crafted your Friday so that you have plenty of time to begin Shabbat well, then Shabbat is going to have an even better experience. You will find things happening more easily without the stress and worry that comes from a deadline. And that's going to make Shabbat even more enjoyable the following week. It's going to perpetuate itself. On the other hand, if you are always leaving it to the last minute, if you're never quite putting aside enough time or energy to do it right, then it's going to make Shabbat not feel as enjoyable. And you probably will not be looking forward to doing it next week either because of the stress it's causing you. And that's going to eventually peel you away from a positive Shabbat experience. So really what this idea is giving us is that we should be preparing for Shabbat in order that Shabbat can prepare us for the next Shabbat. We need to do a little bit extra. And if you find your Shabbat is always coming in as a mad panic and with terror, then you need to reschedule it, or at the very least, tone down what you think your Shabbat should be. Right? A Shabbat does not have to be a 9-course dinner. Shabbat does not have to be everybody dressed in tuxedo and evening gowns. Shabbat needs to be nicer than the rest of the week, but it does not need to be a giant thing. If you are able to invite people to your table, that's beautiful. But if inviting 20 people every week is causing you too much pain, tone it down. Greet Shabbat with joy and make Shabbat peaceful and restful. And then you can add additional elements if you like. But greeting Shabbat well is very, very important. It really does set the tone for everything else that happens. Yedid Nephesh, which is a song often sung in the synagogue, was written by Rabbi Eliezer Zikri, again, in around the 1500s. And this poem expresses a deep longing we have. It's a love poem for our connection with God. Now, there are different versions you'll find in other Siddurim and other prayer books, but the one in our Siddur, this is based on the manuscript written in the author's own handwriting. You'll find that it has a very feminine aspect to the metaphors and poetry. And this was one of the reasons why some other editors in the past changed the author's original poetry to defeminize some of the imagery. But we believe in keeping with the original, and there is nothing wrong with the original imagery, in our opinion, in the conservative movement. And so we will honor the author's original version. Now, Psalms 95 through 99, as I mentioned, these 5 psalms were added in the early modern period, during this 1600s, 15 and 1600s. Now, they were written obviously long before that, but using them as an introduction to Shabbat began at this point. Now, they all speak of singing and they all speak of praising God, as God is revealed in this world through his creation and through his justice. And this is sort of a unified theme for this block of Psalms. And this is the underlying reason of why they, out of all 150 Psalms, were chosen to be the introduction for Shabbat. On the one hand, it is the beauty of creation. On the other hand, it is also reminding us of God's justice, something that perhaps during the week we have lost sight of, either in our own behavior or in observing the behavior of others. Sometimes it may feel like the world is out of whack. But with these Psalms and with Shabbat itself, we are reminding ourselves of what the world should look like. Psalm 29, which doesn't fit that pattern, comes in its own way to basically give us a psalm in honor of Friday, in honor of the last day of creation. As such, this psalm not only speaks about giving praise to God, but also that God's voice, the voice that led to creation, is heard throughout the world. This phrase, Kol Adonai, the voice of God or the sound of God, comes 7 times throughout Psalm 29, and this represents the totality of creation. And the name Adonai itself is repeated 18 different times throughout the psalm, and 18, of course, has a very special place in Jewish thought. The Hebrew letters Chet Yud, which spell the word Chai, are also equal to the number 18 through the way Hebrew is also a number system. So this is reminding us of God as Chai, as life. So from the beginning till here, we've had 6 psalms, which represent the 6 mundane moments of creation. And each of them are either chanted or sung. There's a whole range of different melodies that are used not just in our synagogue, but in many different congregations around the world. And that gives this time a unique feeling of song and of joy. And as I mentioned, all of the psalms that lead up through this are very much emphasized on singing, as is the Psalm of Shabbat itself, Psalm 92, which we'll talk about in a bit. So the more you can sing during Shabbat, the better. Now, if you're looking for, well, how does this sound? I've done recordings in the past, but I'd like to also recommend that you check out the Temple Israel website, tiflorida.org. And on that website, you'll find under our service, our worship information, audio files of the entire service, both Friday night as well as Saturday. So it's a great resource and a chance to hear the great Debbie Mighton singing many of the different melodies that we still use. Which leads us to the biggest song, not psalm, but song, meaning a poem that was written for this Shabbat moment, called Lecha Dodi. Now, Lecha Dodi was written in the 1500s. It was written by a person named Shlomo Alkabetz, and this poem is a masterful reworking of biblical phrases. Most of the words that are found in this song, this poem, are taken from the rest of the Bible, many from Isaiah in particular. And what he does is he reworks them, he puts them together in a new way to try and lead us towards this understanding that Shabbat is really about a theme of redemption, of the ultimate perfection of the world. And he does this while expressing his amazement, his wonder at Shabbat, and uses throughout the metaphor of Shabbat as kala, as a bride, to see Shabbat as being this joyful completion of life. At the very end of Lecha Dodi, there is the custom, in fact, to stand up and turn towards the entrance, to turn towards the entryway of wherever you are praying, as though the bride of Shabbat was walking in at that very moment. And this is a very moving moment when we can truly greet Shabbat as though we were greeting our very own bride. Following that, Shabbat officially begins, right? You might say Shabbat is in the building, right? Shabbat now officially begins, unless it began earlier simply by the timing of the clock, with Psalm 92. Now, Psalm 92 is called Mizmor Shir LeYom HaShabbat. It is a psalm for Shabbat, but the word Shabbat never actually appears in the text. That is to say, the Psalm 92 doesn't say Shabbat except for its title, which is a little confusing. However, if you look at it carefully, if you reflect on its meaning, you will see that what it is trying to tell us is that the ultimate goal of the world is to have this peace, to have the flourishment of the righteous, and to have those that are bad eventually wither. This is the ultimate reminder that God is playing the long game. And yes, it may look like bad people are doing well for a short while, but in the grand scheme of things, it is a short while. Eventually, there will be an eternity which we often compare to Shabbat, an eternity of peace, an eternity of rest. And ultimately, that is where things will truly be justified, where things will be brought to a full accounting of justice. And Shabbat is a day then where we can enjoy that feeling of redemption, that feeling of a never-ending peace in our short 25 hours of experience. So Psalm 92 really is telling us that Shabbat should be more than just putting our feet up. Shabbat should be more than just resting from our work, although, as we've talked before, that is a major part of carving out the time of Shabbat. But Shabbat also has to be a moment when we can almost taste the ultimate victory of good over bad, of those who struggle to be righteous over those who unfortunately choose another path. And Psalm 93 then comes as a follow-up to that and continues with a theme, although heavily built into metaphor, to remind us that, yes, the world can sometimes feel like it is shaken. Sometimes the world can feel like it is built upon moving waters, like it can feel like the ocean is crashing and breaking down the good and strong order that God made throughout creation. But Psalm 93 reminds us that no matter how loud that crashing may be, no matter how destructive it may feel, ultimately there is a stable and purposeful order to God's creation that is enduring and that will rise above any momentary chaos. So Psalm 93 is taking that imagery of Psalm 92 and giving us one more reminder that indeed things are going to be okay. And that is officially the end of the Kabbalah Shabbat segment. Do you have any questions about how this all fits together, how thematically it links? You can either unmute yourself in Zoom or text in the YouTube comments. While you're considering if you have anything you would like to ask or say, please do remember that when you are engaged in the service, whether it is in person, whether it is at home because of our COVID crisis, or whether it is privately all on your own, that this section of the service should really be a meditative time to reflect on the week that has passed and to leave it truly behind so that you are not carrying the baggage of the week into Shabbat, as well as to look forward into a future that is going to be even greater than the past that we have known. This is a very transcendent as well as personal time to prepare ourselves for Shabbat. And it is really one of the most exceptional moments in our entire week. All right, not seeing any questions or hands. Let's go ahead and move to the next part of the Friday experience. And that is study. Now we study all the time, but there is a very common practice to study between Kabbalah, Shabbat, and Mariv. This makes a formal marker between what we have done in this welcoming semi-unofficial, although it's been for 500 years, so it's basically official now, part of our service, and the original, older, more core element of the service of Shabbat, the Mariv. And having the study gives us this break, as well as reminds us of what we are here for. Now, it is very traditional and common to study a text taken from the Mishnah, Shabbat 2:1, talking about different ways of lighting the candles for Shabbat. This is meant not only as a reminder of how to kindle, but also an exploration of what does it mean to truly prepare for Shabbat and to experience it. Many people, myself included, will also use this time for sermon or additional forms of study in order to prepare ourselves for Shabbat in a more mindful and intellectual way. Which then leads us to the true core of the service, and in fact, the true core of any evening service, which is what we call Mariv, also known as Arvit, or you can simply call it the evening service. Now, the Mariv service is mostly unchanged from the weekday pattern, meaning if you are used to saying the service for Thursday night, you're not going to find major changes for the service for Friday night from this point. It'll begin with the Baruch Hu, just like normal. If you have a minyan, it'll go through the different blessings that we're going to cover, and then it will conclude with an Amidah. There are a few things that are changed and added, however, right before the Amidah as well as in the Amidah, but for the moment, just recognize that this is essentially the evening service with some minor tweaks. Now, the first prayer that we do on any evening is called Ma'ariv Aravim, and this celebrates the cycle of night and day. It reminds us that change, including darkness or including all the different seasons, are part of creation. More people are familiar, I think, from our Saturday morning service with Yotzer Or, where we thank God for the gift of light, and that certainly fits into many people's unfortunately stereotypical view that light is somehow better than darkness, but Judaism says that God created both, and both light and dark have their role. Both light and dark play their part in creating our world, and all of God's creations are beautiful and need to be respected and praised. So Ma'ariv Aravim puts us in that proper mood to recognize night and darkness in its proper place. It is followed by a prayer called Ahavat Olam, which is very similar to Ahava Rabbah, which we've talked about is the morning prayer, where we talk about our thanks to God for the loving gift of Torah. After all, creation, light, dark, the sky above us, the heavens rolling, can seem a little overwhelming and very confusing, but God gave us a gift of Torah, a gift of instruction, which allows us to know how the world works and what our place within it is. And this is really one of the most amazing gifts that God has ever given to the world. And creation without Torah would be extremely difficult for us to navigate well. Following those two, just like usual, we have Kriyat Shema, the saying of the Shema. Shema and the Ve'ahavta and the following two paragraphs are said both in the morning and the evening, and always they are there to help us understand God, both God's oneness, to understand God's presence in our life, our reciprocation of God's love, and our partnership with crafting the world, and how that will be marked by both our actions, our clothes, and every other part of our life. So the Kriyat Shema always stands as the highlight of this particular part of the service. There we are. Following the Kriyat Shema, we return to the normal blessing cycle, and Emet Ve'emuna in the evening is the parallel to Emet Ve'yatziv in the morning, and just like that, it is leading us to this logical conclusion. Right? God has shown his desire to redeem the world through the redemption of the Exodus. This is why we talk about the past liberation of our people so much, but in particular in this prayer. And then together with Ma'ariv Aravim, where we thank God for creation, and Ahavat Olam, where we thank God for the Torah and God's love, and then Kriyat Shema and the Ve'ahavta and the other blessing or other prayers, or other paragraphs of Kriyat Shema, where we meditate on God's love for us and our love for God, we can then see that taken together, this will lead to a perfect world in the future as well. And I talked about this pattern at some length in a previous class. So Emet Ve'emuna brings this to a sort of balanced conclusion. Now, if this was a daytime service, this is where we would finish. However, in the evening, we get a bonus blessing called the Hashkivenu. The Hashkivenu specifically seeks to have reassurance of God's care and God's assistance in overcoming the many different dangers and threats that we may feel at nighttime. Yes, like I said in Ma'ariv Aravim, we know that night and darkness are a natural part of God's world, and they are a blessing. However, they still bring thoughts of danger and different types of fears. Anyone who's ever laid in bed wondering what those sounds were, anyone who's ever sat in their room unable to sleep and worried about their future knows that anxiety, fears, and different types of challenges will descend upon us at night. And the Hashkivenu is reminding us that there at night, God is watching over us, even as we are worried or even as we sleep. This gives us confidence during those times of anxiety, and it allows us to look forward to the next day with hope and optimism for what is yet to come. Then we get our first major change from a weekday service, and that is the inclusion of Vishamru. Vishamru is a quote taken from Exodus 31, verses 16 through 17. And in that quote, we talk about the special bond between us and God that is marked by Shabbat. Indeed, Shabbat is called an ot. It is called a sign or a symbol of the covenant, the brit between us and God. So every time Shabbat occurs, It is like staring at your wedding ring and remembering your dedication and your love and the love that's been given to you by your significant other. Shabbat does that same for us and God. So Vishamru is usually sung, often sung very enthusiastically, and it is also recited while we are standing as a symbol of our respect. Following that, we return to the regular order of our service for an evening service, which is the khatsikarish. Now, the kadishes in general all form different types of pauses between different parts of a service. Now, the khatsikarish will usually form a pause in a one section of a service that is mostly of praise before another section of service. In this particular case, we are getting ready for the Amidah. And we are moving from the Mariv service around the Shema to the Mariv Amidah. Now in the morning, we don't have a khatsikarish here, even though technically the Kriyat Shema, the Shema and all the blessings around it is a separate service from the Amidah. In the morning, we like to put those two back to back without leaving a gap between them. And the khatsikarish would be a gap, a good gap, but still a gap. And so in the morning, we don't have a khatsikarish here. But in the evening, we can pause just a moment, make sure that we are in the proper mode and have taken everything from Mariv that we should before we begin the Amidah. And so the khatsikarish provides us that very brief interlude to prepare ourselves for the Amidah. The evening Amidah is recited quietly, meaning privately. There is no formal repetition. There is no formal singing together. And as is usual, the Amidah has the same first three blessings and the same last three blessings. Now, the middle blessings will focus then on the theme of the day. In this case, Shabbat. But it is not just Shabbat per se, the day itself. There is also a general appreciation for creation during this Amidah's blessing. And Shabbat is then tied in as the capstone of creation. And it points us beyond just that physical world. And that's something very important to remember. People will often talk about the world being made in 6 days. It wasn't. Not only not literally, but it was made in 7 days. One of the greatest offenses I take from the non-Jewish breaking of our text into chapters and verses is that the beginning of chapter 2 of creation begins with the creation of Shabbat, with the seventh day. And unfortunately, that really should have been included in the first chapter of creation. But now many people who read and think that those numbers are somehow important see it as being separate from creation itself. But creation was made for Shabbat. Shabbat was not an afterthought. Shabbat was not just God's vacation. Shabbat was an integral part of creation. And our faith and our service reminds us of that every week. When we have finished the Amidah, we then join together to recite or sing part of what we did privately, which is known as Vaacula, which, as I pointed out, is chapter 2 of the book of Genesis, verses 1 to 3, but it's actually the very end of the story of creation during that chapter 1, as we would find it in most books. And like I said, Vaacula is reminding us that this is part of the creation and not separate, and it is not just the absence of work, but it is a unique day created for us. And Shabbat, although its formal observance is only required by those who are Jewish, is really a gift that was meant for the entire world. And I am very proud to say that Judaism was instrumental in helping to create a universal belief that there should be a day of rest for all people. No such thing as a weekend used to exist before Judaism really brought it to a global population. Now, during the Vaacula, we rise because we are acting as witnesses to the truth that God is the creator of all, and that we are giving truth, we are then witnessing as well our relationship to God as we observe Shabbat. So Vaacula is recited while standing. Following that, we then have a section which can be considered a pseudo repetition. Like I mentioned, in the morning or afternoon after an Amidah, we will often have a repetition where the entire Amidah will be recited for the benefit of those who could not do it on their own. In the evening, we don't do that. Right? In general, that's because the evening it's late. People are eager to get home, and doing a repetition would seem to be unnecessary. There are other reasons as well for Jewish law, but I don't want to go into that. On Shabbat, however, we want to recite a little extra, a collection of passages that repeats the themes of the Amidah without actually mimicking the Amidah. And this is done on Shabbat in particular because people who may arrive late coming in from work, getting started a little bit after the rest of us, they are still doing their prayers. And if we were to leave immediately after the Amidah, they would be left alone. This way, we give a little buffer, they can finish their Amidah and then catch up with us, and then they are part of the walk home together experience, rather than having to travel Shabbat evening by themselves. Following that section of passages, we then have the Kiddush. Now the Kiddush, the blessing said over the cup of wine, was originally a home ritual, and it still is a home ritual. However, it became customary to also do it at the synagogue to make sure that everyone, even those who were traveling and did not have the means to do Kiddush by themselves, would still be able to have that experience. The Kiddush emphasizes Shabbat in its two main themes. That is the day of freedom, meaning our liberation from Egypt, and the celebration of creation. Although many people will focus on the creation element exclusively, Shabbat is meant to be celebrated with both the idea of creation and the idea of the liberation from Egypt, our exodus from Egypt. Both of those should be part of the emotional gratitude that we have on that day, and both are put together in that blessing over the cup of wine. And then finally, we, in addition to the other normal parts that we include at the end of a service, such as Aleinu, the mourner's Kaddish, or Kaddish Shalem, the other Kaddish we say, we also have the inclusion of Yigbel. Now, Yigbel is rather unusual. It's not only for Shabbat, but this is a poem that was based on Rambam's 13 Articles of Faith. Now, if you don't remember those, or you weren't here when we began studying the Rambam's 13 Articles of Faith, don't worry, that's going to be coming up in just a couple of weeks. Now, this poem was written in around the 1300s by Daniel ben Yehuda of Rome. And what he did was take Rambam's very long essay on the different principles of Jewish belief and condense it into 13 short little stanzas that were much easier to memorize, to remind us of the essence of Jewish belief. And not surprisingly, once you have a poem, there are those who have put it to music. So there are different musical arrangements that it can be sung to give us this reminder of the core of our beliefs. And it is customary in many communities to make this sort of the last song that we sing for our Friday night service. And that, in a nutshell, is the Friday night service. And roughly speaking, we're about 40 minutes in. This would be about how long it would take to do this if you don't have a sermon or some of the other additional elements that we only do with a minyan, with a group. Friday night services are not very long. They are a little bit longer than a weekday service, but then we should have a little more time to relax. But they are an incredible spiritual exercise, an incredible time to be alone with your thoughts and to share them with God, and an incredible time to connect to all of these themes that perhaps we have not dwelt on as much during the week. So I highly recommend that you either tune in if you are at home for our Shabbat services through the Temple Israel website, or that you will practice some of these and be able to do them yourself. Remember that you can pray in any language, whether you are more familiar with English, Spanish, Russian than Hebrew, whatever it might be. pray in a language that you understand, even as you continue to improve your Hebrew, and you will find that you get much more out of the experience. So before we wrap it up, I know it's a little bit shorter this week than usual. Are there any questions about this or any other burning questions that you're dying to ask? Checking my YouTube, checking my Zoom. Reminder, as always, that you can contact me in many other methods, but this is a chance that if you have a question, well, chances are someone else is wondering too, and I'd be happy to answer it for you as well as everyone else. And again, for our YouTube folks, I obviously can't hear you, but you're welcome to put something into the chat. Just give it a few more seconds. I don't want to just leave everybody hanging, waiting for everyone else. Since I'm not seeing or hearing anything from anyone, then we will go ahead and wrap it up for this afternoon. Oh wait, hold on a second. So John is asking in YouTube, how long in mourning before joining service after blessing for the mourner? So John is referring to, and I will just flip back in our slides, it is customary, it is customary for those that are going through mourning to not come in until we get to Psalm 92, until we have finished Lechadodi and begin Psalm 92, the formal beginning of Shabbat. And he wants to know how long do they stay out. And the tradition is to only stay out that first Shabbat, that Shabbat of Shiva, when you are coming in, because it is not in keeping with your feelings of mourning to be there during the joyous singing that leads up to it. But from Psalm 92 on, we do still have an obligation for being in prayer, and therefore we enter at that point. Any other questions that are just too good to pass up? All right, then we're going to go ahead and finish for this evening. Again, next week we are going to begin with class number 1. This was class 33. So if you are curious of what that might be about, you can always go look in the back catalog on YouTube. But it's always different each year, as we always have different students and different awareness. So I look forward to seeing anybody who is able to join me next week, same time, 6 o'clock, and take care. Good evening to everyone.